friends, it is time for a mid-year wrap-up, and this video is always one of my favourites to film. I love talking about my favourite books and giving you recommendations, because it's not very fun to talk about books that I didn't like because it's not so useful for you. So, without further ado, the first one is the third book in the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I talked about this in my end-of-year wrap-up last year, and I love the third one as much as I love the first two. It's such a perfect way to wrap up this trilogy. It left enough ends open that he's been able to go on and write more stuff, but the story in itself is wrapped up and just in the most amazing way. I think it's one of the best ends to a trilogy I've ever read. And these characters are just I mean, I miss them when I'm not reading them, and I read the whole trilogy twice. I just love them. They're some of my new favourites of all time. So then the next one is English Animals by Laura Kay. This is a weird kind of book. Oh, I've got hiccups now. It's quite different from Mistborn. It is about a woman from Eastern Europe who goes to live and work on this estate, which is owned by this couple, and they have quite an odd dynamic. So she ends up working with the husband on his taxidermy, which is weird and wonderful, and that becomes a thing. And it's also about the relationship between her and the wife, and she tells the wife that she's gay at one point as well, and that changes the dynamic and what's going on. So it's not a sort of really fast-paced plot sort of book, but lots of interesting character dynamics. It reminded me a little bit of Bitter Orange by Claire Fuller, which is a similar situation where one person goes to live with a couple and it very much changes the way they interact. So that's something I quite enjoy and find quite interesting, and yeah, this book was no exception. Then we have Vita Nostra. This is by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko, and it is translated from Russian by Julia Matov-Hersey. This book is bonkers. It is absolutely bonkers. It's unlike anything I've ever read before, and probably the best way to describe it would be Harry Potter meets Haruki Murakami. Very strange combination, but it really works. At least it worked for me. I love this kind of stuff. It's surreal and wacky, and it gets weirder and weirder and more kind of existential, and I loved it. I mean, it starts off quite grounded, but the weird things sort of creep in and it gets weirder and wonderfuler, more wonderful. Yeah. So it's set at a school. There's magic, surrealism. It's kind of literary fiction. I'm not quite sure what box to put this in, but it really works. And if those sound like your sort of thing, like dark academia and surrealism, then I'd really recommend trying this. I understand that this book is not for everybody though, so maybe look into it a bit more if you're not sure, but I absolutely loved it. Then we have The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This is by Taylor Reed Jenkins. Yes. And this is another LGBT book. It is another sort of character-based novel, but there's a bit more plot and a few more twists, I think, that happen in this. It's quite the page-turner, and that is driven by the relationships. So it's about a film star called Evelyn Hugo, and she is looking back on her life and being interviewed by this younger journalist. So she's looking back at her 7 husbands, and the question is, which one was the love of her life? It goes from there, and it's sort of about appearances versus reality in terms of, you know, fame and stardom. So what she projects out to the public versus how she actually feels, what she's actually doing all of that. So this is a beautiful book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's one that I will go back and reread at some point, I'm sure. Okay, then we've got Nevernight by J. Kristoff, which on paper is not a book that I would sort of gravitate towards, but I think it was recommended to me by a few people, so I thought I would give it a shot, and oh my goodness. So this is very dark, it's very racy, it's very dangerous, and I absolutely loved it. It is about a woman called Mia, and she has a cat who isn't a cat, and the relationship between her and Mr. Kindly, the cat, reminds me a little bit of Lyra and Pantalaimon in his Dark Materials, or it's also a little bit like a Patronus, so except not like either of those things. So if you like animals, sort of animal companions in books, this is great for that. He's also super snarky, which is cool. And speaking of snarky, the narrator of this is just bonkers. He's there. I think he's a he. I'm not sure if that's specified, but the audiobook is read by a man, so it comes across that way. And yeah, we're not sure who the narrator is, but he's very knowledgeable, and there are all these footnotes which are in the same snarky tone, sort of just interjects with all this extra stuff. And I usually absolutely hate footnotes in books. They drive me bonkers, but yeah, footnotes. This is all footnote. That would usually really put me off a book, but it worked so well, and in the audiobook it's just kind of woven into it, so sometimes you barely notice that he's gone off on this tangent and we're finding out about some obscure piece of history that maybe connects, maybe doesn't connect to the story. But I really liked that sort of attention to detail, and that continues in the second book as well, which, as I mentioned recently, has some LGBT themes that are explored in this one that weren't in the first, so there's that as well. Then we have The Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty, which is a follow-up from, or a sequel to, City of Brass. I believe this is going to be a trilogy, and as is the nature of series, because this is the second book, I can't really give too much away, but it is set in a kind of fantasy version of our world, or it's set in our world with a fantasy world within it, and this woman called Nari ends up being swept away into this world, and it turns out she has connections to it, which is why she ends up there in the first place. And she is a healer, so that's an interesting aspect of it, and there's lots of political stuff going on in this. I think that's probably the most exciting and interesting part of it, and then there's magic on top of that, which always makes politics more interesting. I think I would pay more attention to politics in the world if there was magic involved. Maybe not. So yeah, there's that one there, and I'm sorry I can't say much more about it, but that's kind of the nature of sequels. This next one is the first book in a duology or trilogy. I'm not sure. So this is The Fever King by Victoria Lee. This has got dark academia vibes, except it's set in a sort of dystopian world. It's in the future where fevers and illness has swept through a lot of the nation and a lot of the world, and it's changed the way things are run, obviously, pretty dramatically. A lot of the population is gone, and it's exploring the ramifications of that. This is set in an academy, and we've got this main character who is sort of thrown in there, and he feels very isolated and different to everybody else there. A lot of technological issues and themes in the book, and also LGBT themes. I thought that was handled really well. And yeah, I really enjoyed Victoria Lee's writing as well. So I'm looking forward to the next one, because I think it will develop a lot of the ideas further. Yeah. Finally, we have Possession by A.S. Byatt, which is a book that I have been meaning to read for a very long time. It's been on my shelf for years, I think since I read The Secret History, because it's a book that has been compared with The Secret History. So it's got dark academia vibes, but I would describe it as being a slightly more, quite a bit more academic version of the Da Vinci Code or something like that, where there's a bit of a treasure hunt going on, and we've got these two scholars in the modern day who are exploring and researching the lives of two poets from the Victorian era. And there are sort of parallels between their lives and the lives of the poets, and it's this treasure hunt basically to find out what happened. And there was a secret romance that nobody knew about, and they find these letters, and the letters are the key to that. And obviously lots of people want to get their hands on the letters as well, so there's tension coming from many different ways, from many different angles. And yeah, it's again quite a slow read, I would say. It's quite a long book, so it's not something that you're gonna sort of race through. I listened to the audiobook of this one as well, thought that was very well done. And yeah, if you like sort of literary fiction, but you also like the slightly more mysterious, I'm not sure how to describe it aside from the sort of Dan Brown parallel, which probably a lot of people would hate me using, but that is what it reminded me of. And it's beautifully written. A.S. Byatt writes very poetically, and seeing as it's about poetry and language, it all fits in very nicely. Anyway, those are the books that I have enjoyed so far this year, or enjoyed the most so far this year. It's not to say I didn't enjoy the other ones, but these are the cream of the crop. I'm in a bit of a reading slump at the moment, so I'm hoping filming this will remind me that reading is great and I should get back to it. Alrighty, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you... Oh, wait. If you have read any of these books or are interested in them, let me know down in the comments, because I'd love to know if any of you go and read any of these and enjoy them, because that's what this is all about. Excellent. See you in the next one. Bye.